Imagine, if you will, for a moment, a world where oppression is normalized, where economic systems exploit the vulnerable, where those who challenge injustice are punished. Well, this is not just a modern reality. It was Paul's world and Silas's world. It was the world Paul and Silas encountered in Philippi. Not too hard to imagine. The story Luke tells, writing early in the 2nd century about Paul and Silas's missionary journey 50 or so years earlier, is not a story with the focus on a miraculous escape, although often it's talked about that way. Rather, it's a story about the radical power of faith to disrupt systems of oppression and bring about transformation. Frequently, the Luke-Act writings contain hints of the accommodation that the Jew and Gentile Christians of this time were having to make to the Roman authorities. They didn't want to draw attention to themselves. They didn't want to be seen as a threat to the imperial way. They wanted to avoid coming to the attention of the authorities and thereby avoid any punishment. But as this story, and there is plenty of evidence that these, as in this story, there's plenty of evidence that these 2nd century followers of Jesus have not forgotten the demand for justice and liberation and the charge to break the chains of oppression and to let the people go free. Paul and Silas were on their 2nd missionary journey around about 49 to 52 AD, somewhere around there. And Philippi was a Roman colony, deeply entrenched in imperial structures. So it's reasonable to suppose Paul and Silas were generally being somewhat careful. After all, they ignored the slave girl who was demanding their attention for 4 days, so the story says. She was pointing them out and drawing attention to the work that they, Paul and Silas, had been doing quietly amongst those who gathered and prayed and spoke together about Jesus. In the end, Paul becomes very much annoyed at this slave girl. And whether from shame at ignoring her or simply because her persistence was drawing attention to what they were doing, which might have been the same thing, he is compelled to do something. The slave girl's affliction, spirit of divination, Luke calls it, was being used by her owners to make a great deal of money for them. In other words, her mental and spiritual health were being exploited for profit by her wealthy and well-connected owners. No wonder the owners were angry with Paul and Silas. Her situation as a slave, a female with no independent means of support, was being exploited for profit. Her spiritual oppression intertwined with economic injustice. When Paul confronted her affliction, and as the story continues, she was healed, her owners retaliated, thereby making quite clear their economic interests in her mental health and their desire to keep her unwell for their own economic advantage. The outcome of the exchange was that Paul and Silas could hide no more. They were exposed. The owners of the girl brought them before the magistrates and had them severely flogged. Their action to heal and liberate the girl brought them to the attention of both the owners of the girl and the public. They were accused of doing the very thing the locals were at pains to avoid, drawing attention to themselves. They disrupted the status quo. They raised up awareness of the plight of an exploited young woman. Does that sound like a story that could be told today? It seems to me that in this pericope there is clearly a restatement in practice of the gospel of God as preached and lived by Jesus. Release the captives, open the eyes of the blind, and let the oppressed go free. Not only was the slave girl the embodiment of this core principle of Jesus, but Paul and Silas themselves became examples too. And their example included the scary illustration of what can happen if you do take action to live out the gospel instruction to bring freedom, liberation, and understanding to all people. It is something we need to think very seriously about. Progressive theology calls us to see the gospel as a force for justice. Jesus' mission, as proclaimed in Luke 4, was to release the captives, give sight to the blind, and let the oppressed go free. In Acts 16, that we've just heard read, we see this in action, not just in the physical release of prisoners, but in the spiritual and social liberation of the oppressed. Progressive theology does not confine itself to theological discussion and liturgical practices, but it is lived theology that finds expression in action, in proclamation, in daring to disrupt the status quo, in having the courage to call attention to itself. How progressive is our theology? I'm aware I'm taking the risk of being seen and heard as political. But I put it to you, I'm urging you to put your theology into practice. The progressive theology we say here at St. Matthew's that we espouse. Use it. I'm urging you to read and to listen to the stories in the media using that progressive theology as a lens, a filter through which to interpret what is being told to you, and to act as you are able to disrupt the status quo and to demonstrate transformative love. In Aotearoa, New Zealand today, it is not difficult to recognise the modern-day equivalents of the slave girl. Nor is it difficult to see who profits from their suffering. But we must ask ourselves how we, like Paul and Silas, disrupt systems of oppression within our local economic and political structures. The Pay Equity Amendment Bill, recently passed in New Zealand without scrutiny, has significant implications for women, particularly those in female-dominated industries. The bill raises the threshold for proving sex-based undervaluation, making it harder for workers to claim pay equity. It also cancels 33 existing claims, affecting around 150,000 female workers, who will now have to start their claims under stricter conditions. Many women in sectors like healthcare, education, and social services were in the process of securing fairer wages. The new law disrupts these efforts, potentially prolonging wage disparities. The bill introduces a higher threshold for proving pay inequity, requiring stronger evidence that wages have been historically suppressed due to gender discrimination. Added to that, changes to the KiwiSaver scheme will also have an impact. Women already face lower retirement savings due to wage gaps. The bill's changes could further entrench financial disadvantages for women when they reach retirement age. Of course, there are men also in these low-paid sectors of our economic system, and we speak for them too. When feminism was rising, we used to say, what is good for women and those dependent upon women is good for all. And this is an example. And the Roman jailer was also a cog in the empire's machinery. That was until he witnessed the power of the faith of Paul and Silas. And then he had a flash of insight. He came to a realization and he saw the system for what it was. He came to an understanding of how that system worked and was transformed. He would lose his job. New Zealand has a history of colonial injustice, of economic disparity and systemic oppression. The Treaty of Waitangi calls us to honour partnership, yet Maori communities still face disproportionate incarceration rates and economic hardship. The story of the jailer reminds us that transformation is possible, not just for individuals, but for institutions. There can be transformation of the interests of groups so that they more readily meet the rights of individuals. We hold on to this faith and work for change in the institutions of our society in the hope that the interests of groups will not trample on the rights of individuals. As a socially conscious church, we are called to advocate for justice, particularly for marginalised communities. We're called to challenge economic systems that exploit the vulnerable, individuals, groups, and the earth herself. We're called to offer radical hospitality and inclusion, as Paul and Silas did. Paul and Silas did not escape quietly. They didn't just slip away. They demanded justice. They confronted the magistrates. Likewise, we must not be silent in the face of injustice. The gospel calls us to break chains, to disrupt oppression and open the eyes of those who are blind to what's going on, and to proclaim a faith that liberates. I leave with you the initiative of Marilyn Waring, who has called together a select committee to examine why the Pay Equity Amendment Bill was passed under urgency without scrutiny, and to hear the stories of women and men on low wages.